Okay, well, welcome everybody to an unexpected discussion session of the working group. Today, we're going to be talking about the National Academies workshop on opportunities and challenges for digital twins in biomedical sciences. And maybe we could also talk a little bit about the interaction we had with the IMAG MSM steering committee last week. That might be relevant. And this will be an open discussion. I need to remind people that this is live streamed and recorded and made available. So you could be as outrageous as you want, but remember that this is going to be forever. So that's something to think about. I appreciate you coming today. As always, Tom and myself and Jim and Lorenzo and Joel are glad to help out in any way that we can. And we have our usual communication channels, which could be used better. Please remember to send Jim any grant information, any publications, any publicity that's related to your work in these areas that you would like to have announced on the working group page. And if there are links to videos that you would like me to promote on the YouTube site, we can do that as well. I haven't really mentioned that as an opportunity, but I'm sure plenty of you have relevant video presentations which we could put there as well. If anybody wants to help out on the videos, I'd be very grateful. We have that MSM viral hashtag. I don't know how many people use it, but it would be helpful. Coming to announcements, the big announcement is that we have Reinhard and Anna's in Building Immune Digital Twins coming up 15th of May to 2nd of June at the Institut Pascal. If you're interested in registering and finding out more, please contact Anna. I'm sure Reinhard could help you as well. If you figure out how to register, please let me know. I've been trying unsuccessfully to get into the website there for the past week. Doesn't seem to like Indiana University email addresses. I don't know if anybody else is having that.
It took me a while to figure it out today, but I did get it through finally.
It's a first step.
I guess I don't qualify to be part of the
neither do I actually.
Okay.
But it's being worked on. So
okay. So any other short announcements to make before we get going? We have a steering committee meeting tomorrow morning at 11 as usual. If you think you should be invited and you're not, let us know. We're going to be talking primarily about the relationship between the working group and Glimprint. Maybe it's worth saying that we've talked a lot about creating this umbrella organization. That umbrella organization now exists as a company. And we're going to be working to try to get it set up as a tax-exempt organization that can be used to further the aims of the working group and digital twins initiatives. And I just got a little link today that I had an interview with Nokia, which has a science podcast series. They do very nice interviews. I believe they've talked to a number of other people in the group as well. And so I can provide a link to that. We can add that to the webpage. I know several people in the group have been interviewed by them. Their reporter, Michael Hainsworth, is really good at asking questions. So it's a fun experience to talk to them. Any more announcements before we get going on our main project for the day? No.
James, I tried the link that you have there, but it just resolves to nokia.com/thought leadership. Is that where it's supposed to go, or?
I'll check once I'm offline.
Okay.
That's the link that they sent me. I confess to not having tried it out. Okay. Coming forward for mini seminars, we have a speaker from the FDA on credibility assessment, which I know is a topic dear to the hearts of many. Maria Abu-Chakra on the 2nd of March is going to be talking about the Canadian Medical Digital Twins Initiative, which she leads. And then we have a number of speakers. There should be our rescheduled originally speaker from today in March. And then we're hoping to get some of the people who spoke at the National Academies workshop lined up to give us talks going forward. As always, please do suggest yourselves, your students, your postdocs, the people you'd like to hear for invites. Lorenzo's been doing a great job of securing speakers. We have moved to an alternating week schedule, but we could certainly, if we have enough speakers, we could certainly add back in the infill weeks. And so don't be shy about suggesting names. So with that, I will come to the main business of the meeting today. I don't know how many of you were able to either attend in real time or listen afterwards to the recording of the National Academies workshop, Opportunities and Challenges for Digital Twins in Biomedical Sciences. Reinhard was the keynote speaker, did a fantastic job of introducing the issues of digital twins for medicine. I think he was really great at expressing, I think, the consensus that is developed in this group. They were very kind to make me and Gary panelists as well. And it was really enlightening from my point of view to hear what they had to say. And with that, I will turn it over to the general discussion.
Well, I'll jump in. Unfortunately, I only could attend the first half. I had a conflict. I was a little surprised at the discussion of the molecular mechanics calculations on protein structure. I thought that was a bit out of place in a digital twin conference. And my other comment was that as I said, so I missed the second half, so perhaps it was covered there, but there was never any mention of digital twins at different scales, different financial levels, different levels of ownership. You know, a Fitbit is something a person owns. It doesn't have to be FDA licensed. It doesn't have to have a doctor involved. A digital pancreas, on the other hand, is probably owned by the patient, but operated by the doctor. And I think something in a clinical setting, you know, you've got an acute respiratory failure patient in a hospital on a respirator and a heart monitor and everything else. In that case, the digital twin would be owned by the hospital or the doctor or the office or whoever. So just something I didn't think they actually covered very well, the range of applicability of digital twins. They don't always have to be giant billion-dollar projects.
I think
what was the last one you saw, Jim? What was the last session you saw?
Up to lunch.
Okay.
Yeah, that was in the last panel discussed this a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought might be good, Reinhardt's slides were great, but I kept thinking I'd love to take that deck and add a slide here or a slide there to create a sort of a consensus deck for this community, because I think it's something many of us could use. Of course, Reinhardt owns the material that he generated, but I think that it might be interesting to try to create a deck that would be a consensus deck. One of the things I was thinking about comes up with validation too. This came up again and again, is if you think about validation, also in science, but what I call virtual tissues, the first thing you do with the models is you post-dict things. You have experimental data. You want to see whether your simulations can replicate existing experimental data. The second thing is that you predict, but you don't use that information. You basically test your model. The third thing that you would do is do prediction and then actually have a doctor take action potentially or be informed by the predictions to make medical decisions, including that information with other information to make an informed judgment by a trained physician. That requires more confidence, but still is only one piece of a complex set of inputs where ultimately the decision is made by the doctor, the judgment about the validity is made by the doctor. And finally, you have something like the artificial pancreas, where the device itself has to make the decision with human out of the loop. And that requires, of course, much more confidence in the ability of the system to work. And so you have essentially 4 levels of criticality and 4 levels of assurance. And if you work through those phases as you develop the digital twin, if those phases are enunciated very clearly, I think that does give you a strategy for validation and confidence. As an example with self-driving cars, which may or may not be the best example, initially they would be used only in very limited application. You keep your hands on the steering wheel. As they get better, there are more and more conditions in which you could use them. You still sit there and monitor them, just the way an autopilot, there's still a pilot in the room looking at what's happening and intervening if something goes wrong. And one issue that came up in one of the presentations, which I think is a very good example, and which is not an option, for example, in the digital pancreas, the artificial pancreas, but could be an option in some of these medical systems, is that in situations where the computer digital twin knows that there's a problem, it transfers control back to the human. So you don't have to have a purely human in the loop, human out of the loop system. You can have systems which are human out of the loop under normal circumstances, and then pull a human in when necessary. The issue there is that transfer of control usually is very dangerous because it happens at moments of crisis, and the person is often not prepared. And so a lot of plane crashes happen precisely when control is passed from the autopilot back to the pilot in a crisis moment. But it is something that's interesting to think about as a possible strategy for deploying digital twins in a regulated way.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. I mean, that's a completely different perspective, right? Or a completely different axis of issues that, have not been explicitly described in that fashion. And I think one way would be, to come up with a compact description of that, right? It's like at some level, it's the human digital twin interface, right? And, successive establishment of trust, I think that would be an interesting thing to write about. I mean, it is not too dissimilar from existing pipelines for decision support, and yeah, so we would have to see how much of this has already been done and what specific DT related issues would cause it to be different than what you would do for any other decision support algorithm, right? The ownership of the data, I think that was touched on in the last session on ethics to a certain degree. I will tell you the thing that I was kind of pleasantly surprised of and then completely threw me off, which is that everyone seemed to have a pretty judicious and measured approach to AI. and I was all ramped up to go, do my usual anti-AI sort of thing. And then it wasn't there. And then I didn't have anything to say. When my session came up, I was completely thrown off by the people who did talked about it in very reasonable terms, with the exception of the guy from the Swedish Digital Twin Consortium, who got quickly shut down by Jeff Shaw, was it? Or I can't remember.
Sachs.
That's right. Who had the appropriate response to what is, the usual type of hyperbole that we're used to. So I think I was pleasantly surprised that in general, the people who had been selected to be panelists were, appropriately measured for that. Even the people we're talking about, generative adversarial networks, the guy talking about creating synthetic populations that way, he was very reasonable in terms of recognizing what the limitations of that method were. So I think that bodes well. That bodes well for this.
So I should say, so I agree with you, Gary. I was watching some of the part of the workshop that's going on right now about digital twins and climate science. And first of all, it was reassuring to see that community is also confused about, or at least also does not have a consensus about what digital twins are.
Yeah, they believe they've been doing it for 50 years.
And there was one of the panelists said, we use AI to do everything that people with numerical simulations can do, and we can do it 70,000 times faster. So there was some discussion after that.
Yeah, so I saw a little bit of that discussion from yesterday. I wasn't able to see the part today because I was sleeping, but I do remember that conversation, and I think it would be interesting. So my opinion on that is that the argument that they're making is not unreasonable, because they have those numerical simulations, they have tons and tons of data. And if you're using the neural network as an approximation of that function, as long as you're not changing the generative laws, I think that's not an unreasonable thing to do. So I think it was really interesting to see the conversation about in this last digital twin thing. But it also very, very, very heavily affected, or is affected by the fact that their starting point is an acceptance that simulation is okay. Right. I mean, their starting condition is that simulation is a valid way of investigating these particular systems. And they don't worry about the incompleteness of it. They acknowledge it's incomplete, but they don't overly concern themselves with that incompleteness, unless you got a different impression, Reinhard. I mean, that domain is all set up for that.
I think Mitchell had a nice point in the chat, which perhaps is parallel to this a little bit, which is, and then I'll come back to Jim's comment in the chat as well, which is that we seem to be assuming from the beginning that we're going to build digital twins of humans. And another thing that you could do, in the sense to build trust, is to first build digital twins of an in vitro system of one cell type, and then build digital twins of a organoid culture, organoid chip system, and then build digital twins of an engineered tissue, and then build the digital twins of model animals. And those may not have direct medical application instantaneously, but they could be simpler. You could have access to more real-time data feeds to see what you could back out, what parameters actually can be inferred in a systematic way. And they're of use in themselves as engineering and data analysis tools. One of the things that was talked about a little bit the other day was using organoid culture of humans as a way of getting the parameters that you need to build a personalized digital twin of an individual. Paul Macklin was talking about working on this with people at Hopkins, where you take a cancer biopsy, you take the cells from the cancer biopsy, you grow them in an organoid culture, and then you analyze the response of that organoid culture to particular chemotherapeutics and so on, as a way of getting the calibration data that one would need for a more detailed biomedical digital twin. Clearly, that's expensive and slow, so it's offline in some sense, but it's not a bad way of bootstrapping. We have to think about training wheels for digital twins, and those are possible strategies for getting there in a way that can be validated. Mitchell, sorry.
Mitch has his hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Sorry, trying to multitask here in lab. Yeah, and I would also argue that from a modeling perspective, like an animal model kind of gives you free reign to say, how can a model and non-invasive estimates compare to these really more high fidelity invasive measurements? Even though an animal model is not the same as a human model, you can at least try to figure out, well, what can I predict from non-invasive measurements that I know I can't go into a clinic and measure invasively, or what, when we think about, temporal prediction, if I can take weekly measurements from a rat and build a model that maybe is able to predict things with only, I don't know, one sample every 2 to 3 weeks, at least you've sort of built the modeling and simulation infrastructure. And then from there, you can kind of argue, well, okay, a rat versus a mouse versus a pig are going to have different physiological responses. But at least there, I feel like there's a lot of data collection strategies that you can test in the modeling framework.
So I brought this up a couple of weeks ago with respect to the FDA's approach towards not using animal models anymore, right? And I think this has been kind of a parallel thing that people have talked about and is actually inherent to virtually all of us who do some sort of this type of computational modeling. It would be, there was so much to talk about in that session, but this almost would go along with the engineering digital twin component, because basically you are meta engineering how you make digital twins with an engineered experimental object, which is the experimental platform.
And I was just making the comment, of course, with the animal model or the in vitro models, you could also do challenge experiments, which you could never do with humans. And so that allows you to test the validity of your models a little bit more harshly than you might be able to do in vivo. Of course, with humans, if you really rolled it out to millions of people, then you'll challenge it pretty fast. And so to me, I think the most important thing is bootstrapping. Once you get any digital twin out there, it'll improve rapidly because of the number of replicas, which comes back to bio.
Red Wayne has a question in the chat. How feasible will it be to use reduced order models for medical-based DT? So I think the answer to that is it all depends upon what your application is, right? I think that was kind of a through line through the workshop, but not necessarily. Was it explicitly stated? I can't remember, but everyone kind of alluded to it depends, right, upon the use case. Reinhard, what do you think about?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was sort of a bit, I don't know, not irritating, but people kept asking this question about is how often do we need to collect data? Does it need to be streaming? Does it need to be every minute? And of course, it depends on the application, right? If you look at cancer, you won't need to sample the patient every minute because your tumor does not change all that much. If you're in the ICU with sepsis, then it's a totally different timescale.
But I think the question was perhaps more about the model side, not so much the, maybe I misunderstood. We should let Redouan ask directly, but I think my understanding, the reduced order models maybe would be something more like physiology models rather than multi-scale models, or database machine learning models, rather than asking the question of what's the frequency of the data feed. But perhaps I misunderstood the question.
Well, maybe I did too. I mean, it seems to me, I mean, if you build a digital twin that's mechanistic, it will be sort of fairly complicated. It will take probably a long time to simulate, and that might not be a useful thing to do. So you could well produce a surrogate model. It could either be less complex, or it could be an AI version of this that you use to actually run and use. So I think, I mean, as a general answer to the question, I would say, yeah, there's potentially a lot of opportunities to reuse reduced order models.
I mean, and again, it depends upon the application. I mean, the artificial pancreas is a reduced order model, right? And so I think I tried to mention this in one of my little bullets, right? Because I was responding to whether or not you need to make a multi-scale cellular mechanism oriented, digital twin. And in many certain cases, you don't need to do that. And from the AI side, if you have enough data, if the system isn't going to change, if you are only going to try and describe and prognose or even optimize existing therapies for which you have data, where you don't actually need to know how the system works, then you don't need to make a model that is detailed from a mechanistic standpoint for that particular purpose. I mean, we can all make the argument that from a scientific standpoint, there's a benefit to it, but from a very pragmatic standpoint, the fact of the matter is they don't need to know what happens as long as they can predict what's going to happen. And then the other component of this is systems that are reducible to trustworthy, compact mathematical representations like insulin glucose response. Classic physiological models. There are closed loop control models of fluid resuscitation in burn patients. There are closed loop control models for anesthesia, because those systems can be reduced into that type of thing. Yeah. So Mitchell, this is Karnakis's main pitch, is that if there's a physics-based neural network that you can come up with, and that your problem case can have a physics-based representation of whatever it is that you're doing, then you can augment the capabilities of a neural network with constraints applied by that physics-based model. So that's why when I talk about these sorts of things, I specifically specify that what I'm talking about with a multi-scale model is a cellular behavior, molecular biology model for which there is no physics representation, and physics-based neural networks don't apply to that, because you can't write a physics equation to constrain that neural network. And that is the problem with that particular system. But certainly there are entire domains of biomedical research in which the types of multi-scale cell mechanism type of thing that many of us talk about is not needed to be done. I see. Did Redouan did you want to?
Sorry, I think my question is more about the fact that we're dealing with parameters that are changing, and we're dealing with more of a stochastic model rather than. I mean, how can we deal with this stochastic behavior when we're using reduced order models?
Yeah, I mean, I think as with it all goes back to whether or not you can have a reduced order model that has behavioral tolerances in which you can treat them as deterministic systems, right? Or at least manage any sort of stochasticity by variation in the parameters that are applied to that particular deterministic model. So to go back to the artificial pancreas, right? There is a certain amount of stochasticity in the individual response to insulin, but that is relatively bounded well enough for that particular control problem, such that it can be managed in a deterministic fashion by using differential parameters. So I think there are different challenges based on the specific component of the system that you're looking at. But I think, it would be nice if you didn't have to deal with stochasticity, because it makes everything a lot cleaner. But in many circumstances, you have to deal with stochasticity, and then that's a separate problem.
Thank you.
This could be one of my naive questions. This is John, but when you're talking about the variability and stochasticness, if you're talking across a big population of people, we understand stochastic means something. And you've got the curves and you've got the tails of the curve. Within an individual, what is stochastic? If you come down to, I now have the digital twin of Reinhard, is his data stochastic or deterministic?
Stochastic, absolutely.
Well, it depends, right? It depends on what the scale you're operating at, right? And whether or not it is important for the particular thing that you're actually measuring. But this is the entire this question of, because you will find people who argue that the perceived stochasticity that we see is actually an epistemic sort of thing, right? That if we had more knowledge, if we could actually measure things, we would identify, precise initial conditions, and we would see where on a deterministically chaotic scheme people actually lie. I personally don't believe that, but I know people who do make that argument. The people who have studied, I think it was actually given as a talk, it is clear that cell signaling is stochastic, right? That gene regulation is stochastic. And yet, when you look at large cell populations in their aggregate behavior, it actually kind of washes out. That's in certain circumstances, in many circumstances, it washes out. So Reinhard and I have talked about this, multiple times to try and figure out a project about trying to actually nail down where biological stochasticity manifests and generates population heterogeneity, right? Because these are two kind of entangled but unclear, and I think John explained it correctly. There is heterogeneity across the population, right? That we know different people have different potentials and different trajectories, et cetera. But for a particular individual, how stochastic is their own individual trajectory regarding their particular, future biological state? And the answer to that is it matters, right? Basically on what you're looking at. I think those of us who've been doing this type of modeling with the intent of doing trajectory forecasting, I know Reinhard does that. We're very interested in that. we think that there is clinically relevant stochasticity, right, for individuals. And therefore, you have to represent your predictions as a forecasting cone that has increasing uncertainty as you go forward in time, as your prediction horizon goes away, just like, how chaotic dynamics manifest for the weather models. But for us, it's some sort of, we assume, and it's just an assumption, that there's some inherent stochasticity associated with something, right? That in many ways is a byproduct of the agent-based models that we make. But, I think when you are going to try and represent a particular individual, and again, I don't think this was actually alluded as much, but was again implicit in the conversation. Other than the guy from Sweden, it didn't seem like a lot of people were thinking that you could basically create an initialization of a digital twin based on a purely static representation of their state. Almost all of the examples that people talked about required some sort of dynamic collection of data, which is intrinsic to a digital twin, and some period of personalized calibration, right, of the behavior of a particular DT to some time series of data that was present, right? Which again, I thought was promising. But that was my impression. I don't know, James or Reinhard, whether you got the same impression.
So I was just typing my comment in the chat, which is some of these things, some situations are clearly, maybe it's worth stepping back. When you're doing simulations, time evolution happens in two ways. You have dynamics, which is continuous in time, and you have events, which are discrete in time or apparently discrete in time. And dynamics tends to be more predictable in some ways. Events, you may know what the event is and what happens during the event, but exactly when it occurs may matter. And so examples where stochasticity is going to matter a lot would be something like the evolution of drug resistance in a tumor after therapy, where the evolution of drug resistance is happening at the level of a single cell. And so it matters whether a cell has a particular effect or not, and you don't necessarily get self-averaging. In particular, even if you get self-averaging, the time at which something happens may be highly variable. You may be able to monitor and predict that you're likely to have a stroke, but exactly when that stroke happens or exactly when that heart attack happens may be subject to fluctuations that are very hard to monitor. And so that's why this idea of digital twins that work during normal situations, which I think Gary doesn't like, may actually not be a bad one to think about. In other words, if you can predict the evolution of the state normally, and then there are situations where you say, I can't predict across this boundary, I don't know when this will occur, that may already be useful. And so it may be useful to separate things which are intrinsically predictable from things that either are predictable in their nature, but not in their time of occurrence, or things where there are multiple outcomes that could occur and you can't predict which of them will occur. And Jim had a comment earlier on that weather forecasting isn't used to control things, but actually weather forecasting is used to control a lot of things. You shut down airports, you evacuate populations.
Yes, but you don't control the weather. Don't control the weather. You make a prediction of how you respond, and then somebody draws a black line on with a marker, but you do not intervene in the weather itself.
Well, so in the workshop, they talked specifically about how their weather models and their climatic predictions and counterfactuals might affect policy. So things like air quality, right? Temperature gradients, thermal effects from cities and things like that. They talked about whether or not how do you incorporate those sorts of things? And how do you make those particular decisions? So on a, right, and I think one of the things from the weather presentation is that they really have a very interesting span of scales that people are interested in, right? There is it going to rain tomorrow? And the other one is, what's going to happen in 100 years, right? So they have this kind of very range of temporal purposes associated with the various types of models that they come up with.
So am I right that a clinical DT would have to be looking ahead by hours, not months?
No, I don't think that's true, because it depends on what you're looking at. And I think the cancer example is a perfect one. I thought the cancer session that James was in was one of the best sessions.
Yes.
Right. And it talked about the time to decision, the time in which you actually needed to, act on something and collect that data. It varies a great deal based on what the particular use case is.
I mean, one reason that cancer is an area where what we would recognize as something like digital twins is used is precisely because the feedback time is slow. The cancer is a slow, relatively slow progressing disease, and therefore you have more time between samples and data points. If you're doing an infectious disease where the immune system state changes over minutes, that's a much harder problem to solve. So I think that's a great point. Again, I want to say that people should feel free. Just because you didn't attend the NAS meeting doesn't mean you shouldn't speak up and express an opinion here. This is an open discussion inspired by the NAS meeting. It's not meant to be only discussing what was said at that meeting. Greg, did you want to say something?
Just that I really enjoyed the entire workshop. I thought it was outstanding. I agree it was uplifting that they, didn't have these imaginary dreams of what AI is going to do for us, and we don't have to know anything about physics or chemistry or medicine or biology. So I thought it was very positive, and I left with the impression that while they said they were in information gathering mode, that I think they were likely to start to figure out how they're going to support this effort. That was, to me, what could be a real positive outcome of that meeting. I don't know when such action is going to happen, but that was the sense that I got.
Yes, I would agree with you, Greg. It was very positive, and if one put stock in the closing summary by I think Rebecca, I don't remember her last name. I think she did a terrific job summarizing this, and it was clear that she captured the nuances of what the definition might entail, how it might be different for different things, and I presume that the NIH and the NSF and the other agencies supported or commissioned this report because they're interested in forging a funding program for this, and so I think we can be optimistic maybe that would be something that this community could apply to.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah,
And we need to be part of how that RFA is written.
Well, we just were, Gary.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean, but that's right. This is a good start.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people in the room who haven't said anything. I definitely want to encourage everyone to speak up. Just because you didn't come on Monday doesn't mean that you don't have the right to an opinion in the context here.
Is
I
that
guess
recorded, James? Is there a recording that everybody can have access to of that entire workshop? I think
Yes,
there was.
it's on the screen at the moment.
Okay, because it was enlightening enough for me that I took very copious notes because it definitely gave me a broader perspective on all the things that I'm doing. I was really very positively impressed with the way the whole session went, and it was important to see it all because there was a lot of feedback between all the different conversations and presentations and panels.
So Greg, one thing we're doing, Lorenzo's been great about this, is we're inviting a number of the speakers from the National Academies workshop to address us here.
Cool.
And we're hoping to have several of them speak in the next few months. If there was somebody who you heard speak that you would particularly like to have us invite for this workshop, please let us know, because Reinhard, Gary, and I put our heads together and said these are the ones we thought were the top 3, but you may have a very different priority list.
Well, unfortunately my notes are at home, but
I don't mean right now. Just let us know.
I will.
Email us.
I
and
will.
We'll try to get them on the agenda.
Yeah. Okay. I'll do that.
We invited the speaker from Sweden, who's, of course, Sweden has its own very big medical digital twins initiative. We're hoping that the FDA speaker will speak to us, and several others as well.
Mm-hmm.
But if there was somebody you particularly thought was interesting, we should definitely be sure that they come and speak to us here.
Okay. Yeah.
I was sorry. Go ahead, Carly. Please go ahead.
I was going to change the topic to something that was briefly discussed earlier. So if you wanted to say something about
No, I was going to say we could change the topic. Was actually what I was going to say.
Okay. Well, I was curious. There was some mention earlier about using dynamic data collection to see the changes over time in order to develop the digital twins versus being able to kind of use a static snapshot to develop the digital twin. And I was thinking it over. Could anyone give an example of where you might be able to use the static snapshot of data instead of the data collected over time?
Well, contemporary personalized medicine, if you say we're going to do a genomic profile and then predict what to do, would be the static example.
Okay.
One of the
All right, go ahead, Joe Reinhard. Sorry.
One of the examples I gave in my presentation was imaging and simulating blood flow in the heart vasculature.
Okay, I see now.
So there essentially you do a one-time image and then you do simulations and you either predict risk or you provide decision support for a surgeon. If that's what you do, then what I said in my presentation is that would sort of technically not qualify as a digital twin. However, if you were to repeat this imaging over time and say adjust your risk scores or adjust medication as a result, then it technically would, at least according to my definition, it would be a bona fide digital twin.
So I guess the digital twin has to consist of repeat predictions forward in time. Now there's a little bit of a complication to the cardiovascular case because you actually are typically making not just single point images, but movies. Because if you want to estimate our heart flow friends, if you want to estimate the mechanical properties of the aorta, you actually have to watch the movement of the aorta through the under different conditions during different phases of the pulse and so on. And so there is some time element, but nevertheless, it's an offline digital twin. You're collecting information and then you're using it in decision support outside, not in real time. And
Yeah,
so,
this definition issue, I mean, Reinhard, you heard it multiple times at the at the weather one too. I think we have to come to some consensus as to what the minimal definition is. And you alluded to it, but every session, someone asked, what's the difference between a model simulation and a digital twin? Every single one. And I think I don't know. I think it has to be said, defined.
Yeah, I think the important point that I was certainly trying to make is building digital twins is much, much harder than building models. One of the things you need to do in order to build a digital twin is you need to build a model, but then there's a lot more other stuff. And if we conflate the two, then, for example, the sort of funding you would design would be no different from the funding you get to build models. And that would not be a good paradigm for digital twin building. I'm sorry, Mitchell, you had your hand up and I barged in.
No, that's fine. It's on this topic. But one of the things I was thinking about after the seminar was, what's the most efficient way? Is it to use really well-established models at fixed time points and adapt them to be more like a digital twin? Or is it better to take the ideas and principles from single time point mechanistic models and somehow make it into this, I can't think of the terminology here mathematically, but something like an evolution equation instead of a fixed system? Because I could see both of them have their pros and cons. And that kind of gets at the definition of a digital twin. Is it a mechanistic model that updates parameters over time, or is it that the model itself and the states update in some way?
Yeah, so I don't think you need to specify that, right? In the interest of inclusivity, a digital twin, and I can't help but go back to the original industrial definition, because that's where the word comes from, right? If we're going to use the phrase digital twin, it should at least call back to the domain in which it was actually initially described. And it is
Amen.
Right? It is a data structure. It is a ongoing data feed to the real world, to the twinned object, and some way of connecting the time points to each other in the simulated digital twin side. That's all that is, right? And so that last one is where the model is. That doesn't specify how you make that model. It just means that there is some computational process that links T1 to T2 to T3, et cetera. This is why the single time point model isn't a digital twin, because it's never updated. There's no feedback. There's no continual data stream for it. The difference between a personalized cancer model that gives you a strategy based on your genomics of the tumor versus one that then modulates that based on the response that you had to that particular chemotherapeutic agent. That's the difference between a personalized cancer strategy based on a model and a digital twin, right? Because there is a for the disease process, a real time in terms of decision making effect on the feedback between the real world and the computational representation.
So I'm going to jump in, Gary, because I was thinking I wouldn't get to have my favorite stalking horse, and Mitchell just asked the question, which is, there are two things here. One, as we mentioned, in the face, as Gary points out, in the face of scientific uncertainty, you're probably not going to have a model. You're going to have an ensemble of models that are going to do in forecast, the way you do in weather. And so there are going to be multiple models with multiple model structures and parameters that are going to be doing simultaneous forecasting. And you're going to have a risk cone based on that. In principle, in classical digital twins, you update parameters, but you don't update model structure as the thing evolves. You assume that the physics or the engineering is known, and therefore the model structure is known. In biology, almost certainly that's not going to be the case. If you have an ensemble model, you can change the weighting of your components as you learn about how well you predict. And that allows you, in a sense, to change model structure in the form of changing parameters, because the weights are, in fact, changing which model structures are emphasized in the prediction. But I think one of the things that we keep having to come back to is, first we need human in the loop workflows for asking the question, given systematic deviations between the model predictions and reality, how do you improve the model, which is what we call scientific research and discovery at the moment. And then the question, can you actually automate that? And in prediction, in principle, AI methods can learn some of those deviations. Other methods can. Karniadakis would tell us you could do a lot with that kind of deviation. Certainly in our stalking horse of the self-driving car, the misprediction is used to inform how to improve the models. And I think actually when we had Rusty talk, one of the things that he said was most useful was when they found systematically under particular conditions, their jet engine digital twins failed to predict, because it meant that there was physics or a situation that was affecting those engines that they didn't know about, that wasn't in the model. And that's how they identified dust clouds from volcanoes as a particular risk factor for airplanes, if I remember properly.
Right, and that same process can be used to determine the constraints on the applicability of a digital twin in medicine, right? Because the uncertainty lies on the model specification side, right, as well. So this goes back to James's earlier initial comment about, this human implementation interface, et cetera. Digital twin should come with a boundary condition for when they should be used, and at what point in time you say this digital twin is no longer applicable for whatever it is I want to do, what it was originally designed for, right? And I think that's kind of part of the importance of defining the use case for these sorts of things, because you identify a failure mode for the digital twin as you would for any other engineered object where it no longer works the way you expect it to work in its intended context of use.
I think a word we might be looking for is credibility. We keep avoiding the credibility. The question is it creditable for what you're trying to do with it?
Well, this is, I think, a little different.
So I'm sorry, John, but I think the problem with that phrase that has that bedeviled the original credibility working group in IMAG is that phrase means different things to different people, right? And I think this was actually in one of the talks, partitioning out the difference between replicatability, reproducibility, verification, validation, et cetera. People very often conflate the term credible with validity, which is how well did that system actually represent the real world system. That is actually not necessarily the intent of the credibility metrics that are used in many other aspects of software engineering, which is, did you use a series of practices that are the industry standard for developing whatever it is that you did? That's separate from whether or not the thing behaves the way you expect it to behave and does it in a replicatable and reproducible fashion so that it doesn't, produce spurious outputs. So I think the credibility question, that term has too broad a meaning, and for discussion of credible, right, it needs to be partitioned into the more specific tasks that are covered by how people use that particular phrase.
No, I was actually taking the credibility word back to its origin, not the credibility as we use it as part of model standards or something. Like, I was trying to make a very simple statement is something creditable for what you want to do with it. You know, not in the big context of model standards, but you're always going to have to ask, is Gary's digital twin in its current state, which has been building data for 20 years, going to be able to answer this next medical question for Gary? And that's always going to be, you know, the need to determine whether the digital twin or the model or whatever is likely to produce a decision that's going to be positive. That's all. Yeah, not to overdo credibility, and I follow all you say because that's the world I came from. But I just mean, is it creditable? We keep talking about when can you use it? When can you use it? Well, that's all the credibility. That's all called, is it creditable for what I want to try to do with it? And then one other quick, well, never mind. I have another question to take offline with somebody about the deterministic versus stochastic, but spinning a little bit out of Einstein's credited statement that everything works exactly the way it's supposed to. And so, you know, we say if we make a medical decision and you administer some treatment and it doesn't work, is that because of some stochastic, it was a dice roll inside of me? Or no, it did exactly what it was supposed to do in that person? And that idea of everything works the way it's supposed to, all we have to do is understand how it's supposed to work in sufficient detail that I'm going to know how it would work if I gave it to Gary right now, or if I gave it to Reinhard right now. They wouldn't work the same, but they would, in both cases, it would do exactly what it's supposed to do. And is that a true concept that we need to keep in mind on the digital twin thinking?
That's a great problem. I don't know if we're going to have time today to dig into that. We're going to have to wrap up in a few minutes.
Not today.
That's the people who believe it's chaotic, deterministic, and we don't have enough information versus the people who think there's some sort of inherent stochasticity. From a practical standpoint, that's not a solvable problem at this time. But I think, you know, yeah, I mean, I think from a practical standpoint, it's an interesting philosophical question, but at this point, it's not answerable.
There I go again with philosophy.
Reinhard, any last comments about things?
No, I think it was a very useful event on Monday. I'm quite optimistic coming out of it, and I think we have a bright future ahead of us. How's that?
So I'm going to be at a conference next week, so I'm not going to be able to see the engineering and digital twin workshop, which to me is going to be fascinating. So I don't know if any of you are able to participate and see any of that. I'm certainly going to check out, you know, the you know, recording when it comes out, but that is, I'm really interested in what they're going to say in that particular workshop.
Yeah, we can learn a lot from that community because it's been at this for a while.
Yeah, that's right. The weather one was interesting, but the scope of their problems and their things that they worry about really did not intersect that much with what we are trying to do.